Welcome back to section 4. In this video, we're going to larger Splunk deployments, as well as the components that make up a larger Splunk deployment. A lot of this material is going to be useful as you work with a bigger Splunk deployment and a distributed Splunk environment. So let's dive into what those components are and what we're going to discuss. So in this video, we're going to look at various Splunk infrastructure components that are broken down into a couple different categories. Some of this will be the core infrastructure, as well as the supporting infrastructure for your Splunk environment. We'll talk about what a search head does, what an indexer does, what a forwarder does, and how those roles work together to make a Splunk environment work. We'll talk about distributed Splunk environments and how you scale or grow your Splunk environment from basically your starting instance to a bigger environment that can handle a lot more data. We'll talk a little bit about configuration management and enforcement and what mechanisms Splunk has to accomplish that. Then we'll also talk about clustering, which kind of plays into the distributed Splunk environments because a lot of times those go hand in hand. But we'll talk about different technologies that Splunk has for clustering. We'll also cover Splunk licensing and look at Splunk apps as well. So I want to talk a little bit about how this all builds on each other. So first, we're going to look at the core infrastructure. This is going to be things like your indexers and your search heads, stuff that you're pretty much going to have in every Splunk environment and the users are going to interact with, whether directly or indirectly. And then we'll also look at, for the next part, the supporting infrastructure. So these are things that aren't necessarily the core infrastructure components like the index or the search head, but they will be parts that are very useful to accomplish other administration or supporting tasks within Splunk. And kind of to wrap this all together under one umbrella, we'll look at distributed environments, how all these work together to accomplish something. Let's take a look at the core Splunk infrastructure, specifically in this case, the indexers and the search head. So to get started, we're going to look here at the core infrastructure, and that's going to be the indexers and the search heads. And pretty much every distributed Splunk environment is going to have both of these as Splunk gets to a certain size. So first, let's talk about indexers. So simply, a indexer is the Splunk enterprise instance that indexes data. So you can think of an indexer like the database server for Splunk. It's where the data actually lives when you're storing data in Splunk. So indexers, as a result, have to do a lot of processing, and they have to be able to service a lot of requests. So it's important to have enough CPU and memory and also disk performance in these boxes. Splunk, by minimum, will recommend 12 CPU cores and 12 gigs of RAM at the time of this recording, as well as disk that can sustain 800 to 1200 IOPS of performance. Other Splunk apps, such as the Enterprise Security Suite, actually even have higher indexer requirements, such as 16 cores or 32 gigs of RAM. And likewise, if your disk performs poorly, it will not work well for Splunk. And you definitely want to avoid using NFS because that's not supported for indexing data and reading it. After you have the indexer, you have the search head. And this is the box that runs the web interface that users use to interact with Splunk. So pretty much all but the smallest Splunk deployments are going to use the search head. In the case of our lab example, the indexer and the search head are combined under the same box. But a larger Splunk deployment, you'll very rarely see that. So search heads are the user interface. They're how users interact with Splunk. And this is where all your reports and your dashboards and your visualizations and all of that live and run in the Splunk environment. So you can also have more than one search head. If you're running the Splunk Enterprise Security Suite that I mentioned earlier, that actually will run on a separate search head most of the time. So you'll have one search head for ad hoc searches and reports, and one for using the Enterprise Security Suite. And there's also redundancy options or scaling options for search head called search head clustering that we'll talk about later. So that pretty much covers the core infrastructure. It's pretty simple. You have search heads and indexers, and you can have more than one of each of them to accomplish different goals.